I drove 3 hours to my parents' house the day after my divorce was finalized, everything I owned packed into the back of my car, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, my old bedroom already had my sister's yoga equipment set up in it, and my mother was handing me a folded air mattress and telling me the garage would be just fine for now. Welcome back to Silent Mirror Stories, where hidden truths finally find their reflection, and quiet people discover that silence often protects the strongest evidence. If you've ever come home in your worst moment and found out exactly where you actually rank in your own family, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what I found in that garage, tucked behind boxes nobody had touched in 15 years, changed everything about how the rest of this story unfolded, and it changed everything about how my family understood themselves as well. My name is Rebecca Solano, and I was 34 years old the night I slept on an air mattress in my parents' garage. My divorce finalized less than 24 hours earlier, listening to the specific hum of my father's chest freezer through the wall while my younger sister slept, comfortably, in the room I'd grown up in, a room she'd been handed the moment I actually needed it back. I need to explain who my family actually was before I explain what happened that specific week, because I don't think any of this makes sense without understanding a pattern that had been building, quietly and consistently, for nearly my entire adult life. I grew up in a modest split-level house outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the older of 2 daughters born to my father, Gerald, a longtime supervisor at a regional manufacturing plant, and my mother, Deanne, who worked part-time at a dental office for most of my childhood. My sister, Kayla, was 3 years younger than me, and from as early as I can remember, occupied a specific, central position within our family's emotional economy, one I spent considerable time, throughout my own adulthood, trying to understand more clearly, and one that mattered enormously to understanding exactly what happened the day after my divorce. I want to describe this dynamic honestly, because I think the details genuinely matter. Kayla was, from childhood, considered the more sensitive of the 2 of us, prone to emotional outbursts that our parents, particularly our mother, learned to manage by consistently prioritizing whatever Kayla needed in any given moment. A pattern that shaped, gradually, and then unmistakably, an entire family structure organized around avoiding Kayla's distress rather than around any consistent, equally applied standard of fairness between the 2 of us. I remember specifically being 9 years old and watching my mother reorganize an entire family vacation because Kayla, 6 at the time, had a meltdown over the specific hotel room assignment, a meltdown that resulted in my parents switching rooms with another family member entirely, giving Kayla the larger bed, while I, without any comparable complaint or outburst, simply absorbed whatever arrangement remained. I want to be honest that I didn't fully recognize this pattern as unfair when I was young. I simply understood, gradually, that being the child who didn't complain meant, functionally, being the child whose actual needs received considerably less attention. I want to describe my own personality throughout childhood, because I think it matters to understanding exactly why this specific dynamic developed and persisted as thoroughly as it did. I was, by temperament, considerably more self-sufficient than Kayla, someone who processed disappointment quietly rather than dramatically, someone who learned early that asking for less generally meant receiving less conflict in return. I don't think my parents consciously decided to favor Kayla over me. I think, rather, that they simply responded, repeatedly, to whichever daughter's need presented itself more urgently and more visibly in any given moment. And Kayla, through some combination of genuine temperament and early learned behavior, presented urgency considerably more effectively than I ever did or particularly wanted to. I want to describe our specific bedroom situation growing up, because it matters directly to everything that eventually happened the day after my divorce. I had, throughout my entire childhood, a modest bedroom at the end of the upstairs hallway, a room I decorated myself over the years, filled with the specific accumulation of a childhood, awards from academic competitions, photos with friends, the particular collection of small, meaningful objects that make a bedroom feel genuinely like your own space, rather than simply a room you happen to sleep in. I left for college at 18, and I want to describe what happened to my bedroom during those years, because it establishes a pattern that would matter considerably to my eventual understanding of what happened after my divorce. My parents converted my room, within about a year of my leaving, into a combined guest room and craft space for my mother, a transition I understood, at the time, as entirely reasonable, since I was building my own independent life and didn't genuinely need a preserved childhood bedroom waiting for me indefinitely. Kayla, notably, left for college 2 years after I did, and her own bedroom remained, throughout the following decade, almost entirely untouched, my parents maintaining it, deliberately, as a space she could return to during breaks and holidays, a specific asymmetry I noticed but didn't dwell on excessively at the time, understanding it, generously, as perhaps simply reflecting different specific choices Kayla and my mother had made together about her own space, rather than as evidence of any broader pattern. I want to describe my own adult life honestly, because I think it matters to understanding exactly how devastating that specific week following my divorce eventually became. I met my ex-husband, Thomas, at 26 and married him at 28, building, over the following 6 years, a genuinely stable life together, a modest house we'd purchased together outside Philadelphia, careers we'd both built with considerable effort, a marriage that, from the outside, appeared entirely solid to almost everyone who knew us, including, I want to be honest, myself for most of those years. I want to describe what actually happened to that marriage, because I think the specific circumstances matter to understanding exactly how vulnerable I was, emotionally, during the exact week my parents' behavior became so genuinely revealing. Thomas had, over the final 18 months of our marriage, developed a relationship with a coworker, a betrayal I discovered gradually, through a combination of small inconsistencies and, eventually, direct confirmation that devastated me in ways I'm still, honestly, working through even now. I want to describe the specific timeline of our divorce, because it matters to understanding exactly why I arrived at my parents' house in the particular emotional and practical state I did. The divorce proceedings took roughly 8 months, a period during which I moved into a small rental apartment, exhausted my modest savings on legal fees and the practical costs of establishing an independent household, and generally navigated one of the most difficult periods of my entire adult life largely alone, my own parents offering, throughout those 8 months, the specific kind of distant, minimal support that I now recognize, in hindsight, as another instance of a pattern I'd absorbed for years without fully nomming it. I want to describe the specific circumstances that brought me to my parents' house the day after my divorce was finalized. My rental lease had expired roughly 2 weeks before the final court date, a timing coincidence that meant I genuinely had nowhere else to go once the divorce concluded, my modest savings insufficient to secure a new apartment immediately given the deposits and fees involved, a specific, vulnerable financial position that made my parents' house feel, in that moment, like my only genuinely available option. I called my mother roughly a week before the final court date, explaining my situation directly, asking whether I could stay with them temporarily while I rebuilt my finances and found permanent housing. I want to describe her response because it initially struck me as entirely warm and supportive, telling me, of course, that family helps family, that my old room would be waiting for me, a promise that, I want to be honest, generated a specific, genuine relief during an otherwise devastating period. I want to describe the drive to my parents' house that specific day, the day after my divorce was finalized, because I think the emotional state I was in matters considerably to understanding exactly how devastating what awaited me actually felt. I'd spent the morning in a courtroom, formally ending a 6-year marriage, and I drove the following 3 hours in a kind of numb, exhausted haze, everything I still owned packed into my car, genuinely believing, based on my mother's earlier promise, that I was driving toward at least a temporary version of safety and stability. I want to describe pulling into that driveway, because the specific details of that exact moment have stayed with me with a clarity I wish, honestly, I could soften somewhat even now. I noticed, Immediately, unfamiliar exercise equipment visible through my old bedroom's upstairs window. A specific, small detail that generated an immediate, disorienting confusion before I'd even made it inside the house. I want to describe walking into that house, because my mother's specific explanation, delivered with a casualness that genuinely stunned me, revealed exactly how little thought had apparently gone into what this moment would actually mean for me. She told me, almost offhandedly, that Kayla had recently decided she needed a dedicated yoga and meditation space, and that since my old room was just sitting there anyway, it had made sense to let Kayla set up her equipment there roughly 2 weeks earlier. I want to describe what I felt hearing this, because I think it matters to understanding my subsequent, considerably complicated response. I felt something considerably beyond simple disappointment, a specific, cold recognition that even during the absolute worst week of my entire adult life, my own comfort and stability had apparently ranked below Kayla's desire for a dedicated yoga space, a realization that arrived with a clarity I hadn't fully allowed myself to feel about my family's priorities throughout the preceding decades. I want to describe what my mother offered me instead, because the specific casualness of this offer matters enormously to understanding the full weight of what was actually happening. She handed me a folded air mattress, along with a space heater, and told me the garage would be just fine for now, mentioning that they'd cleared a small area near the workbench, and that I could plug in the space heater since the garage got a little cold at night this time of year. I want to describe my father's role in this specific conversation, because his particular silence throughout it revealed something I genuinely never fully confronted before that exact moment. He stood nearby throughout my mother's entire explanation, saying nothing, offering no alternative suggestion, no acknowledgement that perhaps giving his recently divorced daughter a garage, while her sister enjoyed a dedicated yoga studio, represented anything worth reconsidering, a silence I recognized, in that moment, as its own specific, considerable form of complicity. I want to be honest about my immediate reaction, because I don't think I responded, in that first moment, with the clarity or directness the situation genuinely warranted. I was, honestly, too exhausted and too emotionally depleted from the preceding day's court proceedings to mount any kind of forceful objection. I simply took the air mattress, thanked my mother in a voice that carried considerably less genuine gratitude than the words themselves suggested, and carried my belongings into the garage myself. I want to describe that first night, because I think the specific physical and emotional discomfort of it matters to understanding everything that happened over the following several days. The garage was, genuinely, cold, the space heater doing little to meaningfully warm the concrete floor beneath my air mattress, and I lay there, surrounded by decades of accumulated storage boxes, listening to the specific mechanical hum of my father's chest freezer through the thin wall separating the garage from the kitchen, processing, in a kind of stunned, exhausted silence, exactly how thoroughly my family's actual priorities had just been revealed to me. I want to describe the following several days honestly, because I think the specific pattern that continued to unfold matters enormously to understanding exactly why I eventually decided to investigate what those storage boxes actually contained, a decision that would end up reshaping considerably more than just my own immediate housing situation. Kayla, I want to describe honestly, showed no particular awareness or concern about the specific arrangement, greeting me casually each morning, apparently genuinely oblivious to any discomfort in the situation. A specific obliviousness I recognized, watching it unfold, as its own particular consequence of having spent an entire lifetime never once having to consider whether her own needs might be displacing anyone else's. I want to describe a specific conversation I had with my mother, roughly 3 days into this arrangement, when I gently raised the possibility of perhaps rotating the bedroom situation, or at minimum, finding some warmer alternative to the garage. My mother's response revealed, with a specific clarity I hadn't previously experienced quite this directly, exactly how she genuinely understood the situation's relative priorities. She told me that Kayla's yoga practice was really important for her mental health right now, and that surely I could understand, given everything I'd just been through myself, why disrupting Kayla's newly established routine might not be the most compassionate choice in that particular moment. I want to describe what I felt hearing my own recent trauma used, specifically, as justification for prioritizing my sister's yoga mat over my own basic physical comfort, because it generated a specific, clarifying anger that I think ultimately shaped everything I did over the following weeks. I didn't argue further in that specific moment. I simply nodded, returned to the garage, and began, quietly, formulating a considerably more deliberate plan than simply continuing to hope my family's priorities might eventually shift on their own. I want to describe the specific afternoon, roughly 5 days into my stay, when I began genuinely, systematically going through the garage's accumulated storage, initially simply out of a practical need to organize enough space to make my own temporary living situation slightly more livable, clearing boxes away from the specific corner where my air mattress sat. I want to describe what I found, because it's the detail that eventually transformed this entire story from a painful but ultimately private family disappointment into something considerably more significant for our entire extended family. Tucked behind a stack of boxes containing old Christmas decorations, I found a smaller, considerably older box, labeled simply, in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting, with my own name. I want to describe opening that box because I genuinely had no idea in that moment what it might contain. My grandmother, my mother's own mother, had passed away roughly 15 years earlier, when I was 19, and I hadn't specifically thought about her personal belongings in years, assuming, generally, that whatever she'd left had been distributed and dealt with long ago. I want to describe what was actually inside, because it revealed something I genuinely hadn't anticipated. The box contained a series of personal letters my grandmother had written, apparently over the final several years of her life, along with a formal, sealed envelope containing what turned out to be a separate, handwritten addendum to her own will, a document I'd genuinely never known existed, specifically leaving me a modest but meaningful sum of money, roughly $40,000, along with a specific piece of jewelry that had belonged to her own mother. A bequest my grandmother had apparently intended specifically and exclusively for me. I want to describe the specific letter accompanying this discovery, because its contents revealed, with a clarity that genuinely stunned me, exactly how long certain family dynamics had apparently been visible to at least one person who'd never directly said anything to me about it during her own lifetime. My grandmother had written, in careful, deliberate handwriting, that she'd watched, over the years, how differently my parents treated Kayla and me, that she'd worried considerably about how this pattern might eventually shape my own sense of my worth within the family, and that she wanted to ensure, specifically and formally, that at least one person in this family had clearly, explicitly recognized and valued me as fully and completely as I genuinely deserved. I want to be honest about what I felt reading this letter, sitting on the cold garage floor surrounded by decades of my family's accumulated storage, because it generated a specific, overwhelming flood of emotion I hadn't expected at all. I cried, genuinely, for the first time since my divorce had actually finalized, understanding, with a clarity that felt both devastating and somehow clarifying, exactly how long this specific pattern of favoritism had apparently been visible, even to family members who'd never directly intervened while they were alive. I want to describe the specific problem this discovery immediately revealed, because it's the detail that transformed this from simply an emotional, private discovery into something requiring genuine, practical action. The addendum, dated and properly witnessed according to my grandmother's own careful handwriting, had apparently never actually been formally filed with her original will, a fact I confirmed the following day, contacting the attorney's office that had handled my grandmother's original estate, discovering that they had no record of this specific addendum ever having been submitted or incorporated into the will's formal probate process, a process that, I confirmed, had concluded and formally closed years earlier without any of these specific provisions ever having been honored. I want to describe the following several weeks honestly, because I think the specific investigation that followed matters considerably to understanding exactly what this discovery eventually revealed about my own parents' role in this entire situation. I retained an estate attorney directly, a careful, thorough woman named Patricia Alvarez, who confirmed that while the addendum's late discovery genuinely complicated any formal legal claim, given how much time had passed since the original estate had closed, there remained a legitimate legal pathway to petition the court to reopen probate, specifically given genuinely new evidence of the deceased's actual, documented final wishes. I want to describe what Patricia's investigation eventually revealed regarding exactly how this specific box ended up in my parents' garage, rather than having been properly delivered to the attorney's office at the time of my grandmother's death, because it's the detail that transformed my understanding of this entire situation considerably further. Patricia's office, working through my grandmother's original estate records, discovered that my mother had, in fact, been present when my grandmother's personal effects were originally sorted through, following her death, and had specifically taken possession of several boxes of sentimental items at that time. Boxes that, according to the estate's own contemporaneous records, had never been formally inventoried or reviewed by the estate's attorney before my mother removed them directly to her own house. I want to describe the specific conversation I eventually had with my mother once this full picture became clear, because I think it reveals something genuinely important about how deeply certain patterns had apparently shaped her own choices over the years, whether consciously or not. I confronted her directly, explaining what I'd found and asking her, plainly, whether she'd known this addendum existed when she'd taken possession of that specific box 15 years earlier. I want to describe her reaction, because it revealed something I found genuinely difficult to process, even having anticipated some version of a difficult response. She admitted, after a considerable, uncomfortable silence, that she had, in fact, glanced through some of the box's contents at the time, including, she eventually acknowledged, at least partial awareness of the addendum's existence, though she claimed, and I want to be honest that I've never fully been able to determine whether this claim was genuine or simply a convenient explanation offered after the fact, that she'd assumed at the time. That the document wasn't legally significant, since it hadn't been formally filed with the will itself. I want to describe what I believe actually happened, understanding that I can't offer complete certainty about my mother's genuine internal reasoning 15 years ago, but based on everything Patricia's investigation eventually revealed, and everything I'd witnessed throughout my entire life regarding my family's specific pattern of prioritizing Kayla, I came to believe that my mother had, at some level, recognized this document represented a specific, formal acknowledgement of favoritism she'd rather not have permanently, legally documented, and had chosen, deliberately or through a specific kind of convenient self-deception, to simply set it aside rather than ever formally addressing it. I want to describe the formal legal process that followed, because Patricia's petition to reopen probate, presented alongside the properly witnessed addendum and clear documentation, establishing exactly when and how it had been improperly withheld from the original proceedings, ultimately succeeded, roughly 4 months after that initial discovery, in formally recognizing my grandmother's actual final wishes, the modest inheritance, and the specific piece of jewelry finally, legally, becoming mine. 15 years after she'd originally intended it. I want to be honest about where things stand now, several months out from that discovery, because I don't think a fully warm, comfortable family resolution accurately represents everything that's happened since. My relationship with my mother remains genuinely, considerably strained, a distance I understand as the direct, difficult consequence of finally, formally confronting a pattern of favoritism that had apparently been significant enough, even 15 years ago, for my own grandmother to feel compelled to document it explicitly, and significant enough, apparently, for my own mother to have quietly suppressed that documentation rather than ever addressing it directly. I moved out of my parents' garage roughly 6 weeks after that original discovery, into a modest, but genuinely my own apartment, funded partly through the inheritance my grandmother had always intended for me. a specific, meaningful circularity that I've thought about considerably since, understanding that the very discovery revealing exactly how thoroughly my family had prioritized Kayla over me also, ultimately, provided the specific means for me to build genuine independence from that entire pattern. I want to describe my relationship with Kayla now, because I think it's evolved in ways I genuinely didn't anticipate. She apologized to me directly, roughly 2 months after everything became clear, acknowledging, with what I believe was genuine discomfort, that she'd never fully considered how consistently our parents had prioritized her own comfort over mine throughout our entire lives, an acknowledgement I appreciated. Though I want to be honest that our relationship remains considerably more careful and considerably less automatically warm than it perhaps once was, both of us, I think. Still working through exactly what this entire situation revealed about the family we'd both grown up inside. I still keep my grandmother's original letter, along with the formal court documentation eventually recognizing her actual final wishes, in a folder among my other important personal records, not out of any particular ongoing bitterness, but as a specific, permanent reminder of something I understood clearly, sitting on that cold garage floor 15 years after she'd written it, that sometimes the people who love you most clearly aren't the ones closest to you day to day, but the ones who took the time, even from a considerable emotional or physical distance, to formally, permanently document exactly how much you actually mattered, regardless of whether the people around you at the time ever fully recognized it themselves. My parents gave my sister my childhood bedroom the day after my divorce and told me to sleep in the garage, certain that whatever discomfort this arrangement caused me would simply pass, quietly, the way similar arrangements always had throughout my entire life. What they never anticipated was that the exact space they'd relegated me to, cold, cluttered, and genuinely uncomfortable, contained the one thing capable of finally, formally documenting exactly how long this specific pattern had actually been visible. Even to someone who'd passed away 15 years earlier, still cared enough to make absolutely certain the truth would eventually find its way to me. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Silent Mirror Stories, where every reflection reveals another hidden truth. Tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered something completely unexpected during your family's absolute lowest moment, something that ended up changing everything that came after it?